22 minutes. That's the maximum one-way communication delay between Earth and Mars. Meaning, if something goes wrong, medically, mechanically, psychologically, and you call for help, the response arrives 44 minutes after the crisis began, at minimum. At maximum, when the planets are on opposite sides of the Sun, it's longer. On the ISS, real-time video calls with family are standard. Crew members talk to psychologists weekly. Care packages arrive on cargo flights. If something goes seriously wrong, there's an escape pod, a Soyuz or Crew Dragon docked and ready for emergency return. On a Mars transit, none of that exists. No real-time calls, no resupply, no abort. 7 months in a volume smaller than a studio apartment, with the same handful of people, watching Earth shrink to a dot. The engineering community spends billions on radiation shielding, propulsion, life support. The behavioral health budget is a rounding error, and the data says it shouldn't be. NASA classifies the psychological risk of current 6-month ISS missions as yellow, moderate. Planetary missions, such as a surface stay on Mars, are classified red, high risk. That's not a guess. That's from a 2024 presentation to NASA's Human Risk Board, based on decades of accumulated data. The data comes from multiple sources, and almost none of them make headlines. The first is the ISS itself. NASA's Behavioral Health and Performance Group has been monitoring astronauts for over 20 years. Using the integrated medical model, they've estimated that a significant percentage of crew members meet clinical criteria for anxiety or depression during long-duration flights. The numbers vary by study and methodology, but the direction is consistent. The longer the mission, the higher the incidence. Brain imaging studies add another dimension. Scans show measurable increases in brain volume that scale with mission duration. The brain physically changes in microgravity. Research published in recent years suggests that intervals of less than 3 years between missions may not be sufficient for full neurological recovery. That finding alone should reshape how we think about crew scheduling for any sustained lunar or Mars program. These findings don't mean astronauts are fragile. They're the most rigorously selected, trained, and supported humans on the planet. The point is that even with all of that, the screening, the training, the weekly site calls, the care packages, the environment still leaves a mark. And on a Mars transit, the support infrastructure that keeps ISS manageable simply doesn't exist. The second source is simulation. In 2010 and 2011, an international crew of 6 spent 520 days locked in a facility near Moscow for the Mars 500 experiment, the longest high-fidelity isolation study ever conducted. No sunlight, simulated communication delays, controlled diet. What happened was not dramatic. It was insidious. Sleep patterns degraded, not suddenly, but in a slow drift that accelerated in the second half of the mission. Physical activity dropped. 2 of the 6 crew members showed signs of chronic sleep disruption that worsened steadily over the full 520 days. Social interaction narrowed. Conversations became shorter, more transactional, less personal. Humor decreased. One crew member spent increasingly long periods sedentary and withdrawn. The psychological term is behavioral disengagement. The researchers noted something else. The crew's perception of time changed. Days blurred together. The lack of external cues, no seasons, no sunrise, no variation in routine, created a monotony that compounded the isolation. Several participants reported difficulty distinguishing one week from the next toward the end of the experiment. Nobody snapped. Nobody had a breakdown. The deterioration was gradual, measurable, and, in the context of a real mission, dangerous. Because on Mars transit, quote 2 from a crew member responsible for a critical system isn't a journal entry. It's a mission risk. The third source is history, and this one is worth telling properly. 1973, Skylab 4. The third and final crew to occupy America's first space station. Commander Gerald Carr, pilot William Pogue, scientist Edward Gibson. The mission was 84 days, the longest American spaceflight at the time. The previous crew, led by Alan Bean, had set a grueling pace and completed more science than planned. Mission Control expected the new crew to maintain that momentum. They couldn't. The schedule was relentless, every minute accounted for, with tasks stacked back to back and little unstructured time. Communication with the ground was constant, and often felt controlling. The crew fell behind almost immediately, and the gap between schedule and reality grew wider each week. Tension built, small frustrations compounded, and then, depending on which account you read, the crew took an unscheduled day off. Some descriptions say they disabled the radio for a period. Others frame it as simply turning off the teletype and spending a day doing unscheduled maintenance and personal time. NASA doesn't officially call it a mutiny. The crew members, in later interviews, downplayed the incident, but something broke in the relationship between space and ground, and for a period, the astronauts stopped following the schedule the controllers had set. The Skylab 4 incident is usually told as an anecdote, a curiosity, but it's the only documented case of a crew in space pushing back against mission control in a way that disrupted operations. And it happened 84 days into a mission, with real-time communication, with Earth visible from the window. A Mars mission is over 500 days, without real-time communication, without the ability to see Earth as anything more than a bright star. There's a phenomenon that researchers studying Antarctic winter over crews and submarine deployments have observed: autonomization. Over time, isolated groups develop their own internal norms, start filtering what they communicate to outside authority, and begin to perceive mission control, or headquarters, or command, as adversaries rather than support. Studies of ISS crews have documented displacement of negative emotions toward ground personnel. Crew members interacted less with some mission control staff, perceiving them as opponents. On the ISS, this is manageable. Communication is real-time. Conflicts get mediated. Psychologists intervene early. On a 500-day Mars transit, autonomization isn't a risk factor. It's almost inevitable. The crew will, by necessity, become self-governing. The question is whether that transition happens as a planned, supported evolution, or as a gradual disconnection that nobody on Earth sees coming until it's too late to address. What makes this problem different from every other spaceflight risk is that it doesn't have an engineering solution. You can't shield against loneliness. You can't filter isolation out of the air supply. There's no way to build redundancy into a human relationship, the way engineers build it into a fuel line. The countermeasures that exist, crew selection, pre-mission team building, automated psychological support tools, VR relaxation environments, are real, but they're early stage. ESA is testing VR for mental health on the ISS right now. NASA has studied automated psychotherapy tools. These are the beginning of an answer, not the answer itself. There's something HALE finds quietly disturbing about the way this risk gets discussed, or, more precisely, doesn't. Every conference presentation about Mars colonization includes slides on propulsion, on radiation shielding, on ISRU. The psychology slide, when it exists, is usually last, shortest, most vague. Behavioral health will be addressed through crew selection and countermeasures. That sentence carries the weight of the hardest unsolved problem in human spaceflight, and it fits on a single bullet point. The submarine parallel is useful and limited. Submarine crews are isolated, confined, operating under stress for months at a time. The psychological literature from the U.S. Navy and Royal Navy documents similar patterns: tension displacement, social withdrawal, sleep disruption. But submariners are on Earth. They know the mission has a fixed endpoint. They know that in a genuine emergency, the boat can surface. The psychological load of being unable to return, of knowing that the nearest hospital, the nearest conversation without a 22-minute lag, the nearest fresh air is months away and getting further. That's qualitatively different from any analog available on this planet. The Antarctic comparison is closer. Winter-over crews at remote stations spend months in continuous darkness, cut off from the outside world, in small groups with no possibility of evacuation. The psychological literature on Antarctic expeditions is extensive and sobering. Elevated rates of depression, insomnia, cognitive dulling, and interpersonal conflict. Irritability that builds imperceptibly. Withdrawal that looks like introversion but is actually retreat. Some stations report, quote, a measurable deterioration in mood and group cohesion roughly 3/4 into the deployment. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but the pattern is robust enough that Antarctic program managers plan for it. Whether this translates to spaceflight is debated. ISS data hasn't consistently confirmed it, but ISS missions have real-time ground support, which may mask the effect. A Mars transit wouldn't have that buffer. We spend billions engineering the vehicle. We spend comparatively little understanding the people inside it. The assumption seems to be that the right selection process will produce crews resilient enough to handle anything. The Skylab 4 crew was selected by that same process. The Mars 500 participants were screened extensively. The deterioration happened anyway, not because the people were weak, but because the environment is genuinely, measurably hostile to sustained human well-being. A Mars mission will fly when the rocket is ready, the shielding is sufficient, and the life support works. The question, the one that doesn't fit on an engineering roadmap, is whether the people inside will arrive functional, not just alive, capable of making good decisions, maintaining relationships, and performing complex tasks after 500 days in a sealed volume with no exit. The data doesn't answer that yet, but the data that exists is clear about one thing. This is not a secondary problem. This is the problem, and it's the one that gets the last slide and the smallest budget. The next video is about money, but a different kind. 2 rockets. One costs $2.2 billion per launch. The other aims for $100 million. The difference isn't technology, it's something structural, embedded in the way contracts get written and defended and perpetuated across decades. And it connects to everything we've talked about, because the system that underfunds behavioral health research and the system that overbuilds a Senate-mandated rocket might be the same system, driven by the same incentives, answering to the same budget calendar.